Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Global Engagement Online Series, also known as GEOS, a program of the United Nations Association of the USA. My name is Anna Mahalik, and I've served as the Youth Engagement Manager at the National Office for the past 4 years, and I'm really delighted to be with you as part of this important dialogue on Indigenous rights at the UN, and we're celebrating this ahead of the International Day of World Indigenous Peoples, which is recognized annually on August 9th, coming up this Sunday. So the theme for this year's International Day is COVID-19 and Indigenous peoples' resiliency. As we fight against the spread of this pandemic, we at UNA USA recognize it is more important than ever to safeguard the rights of Indigenous peoples and their knowledge. Their territories are home to 80% of the world's biodiversity, and they can teach us so much about how to rebalance our relationship with nature and reduce the risk of future pandemics. Today, we'll hear from 3 guest speakers on how they work with Indigenous communities internationally and right here in the US to elevate Indigenous voices to elected officials and those at the UN. It's our hope that after today, you will have a better understanding of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, how the Sustainable Development Goals and Indigenous rights intersect, and how you can advocate for policies that uphold and protect the rights and voices of Indigenous peoples. You'll soon hear from our guest speakers, after which there will be time for questions and answers from the audience. And if you have questions at any time, please type it in using the Q&A box feature on Zoom, which can be found at the bottom of your screen on your navigation bar. Selected questions will be read aloud to our panel as time permits. And please note that the chat box will not be monitored, but you can use the chat box to access a link for speaker bios to learn more about our speakers here today. And I'm going to introduce them now, and I'll introduce them one by one and have them provide a brief overview of themselves and their work. So we're going to start today with Dr. Elizabeth Rule. Dr. Rule is the director of the AT&T Center for Indigenous Politics and Policy and assistant professor of professional studies at the George Washington University. She's an enrolled citizen of the Trc Nation. And Dr. Rule, I just want to say we're so grateful that you can join us for this program, and we'd love for you to tell us more about you and your work.
Thank you so much for having me. It's my pleasure to be here on this important occasion and to discuss such important topics. So Chokma, everyone. My name is Elizabeth Rule, and I'm a citizen of the Chickasaw Nation. And Chokmashki to everyone for being here and tuning in to learn more about, again, what are really some very critical issues. Just to give you an idea about me, where I come from and the work that I do today. I currently live and work in Washington, D.C. As the director of the AT&T Center for Indigenous Politics and Policy, which is the only university-based Indigenous policy research center in Washington. This is really important because, of course, we're in the nation's capital, and Indian country as nations, as sovereign Indigenous governments, have a great deal of interaction with the federal government. And for that reason, Washington becomes a really central location for the work that we do. But I haven't always been here. I was born in Houston, Texas, and since then have lived really all over the United States. I spent some years in my childhood in Pocatello, Idaho, a lot of time in San Diego, California. I attended high school in rural Pennsylvania and then worked my way up the East Coast, attending college in Connecticut, graduate school in Rhode Island, and then finally coming back down here to Washington. You know, and my work really, my journey that led me to my career has been primarily focused around education. When I was attending high school, like I said, I was in a very rural area and I was the only Native student at that school. It was a predominantly white institution. And I had aspired to attend an Ivy League school. That was a personal goal that I had set for myself. And I knew all along that I wanted to work in a field that served Native people. And the example that was set for me was that that type of work could be done through law. and through the legal field, right? My dad has worked in the field of tribal law for a number of years exclusively. And I know that I'm not alone in saying that that has been such a strong model for our Native youth as a form of advocacy. But when I went to college, I was set on attending law school myself, but I had some great mentors that actually opened up a new world for me by showing me the power of education and research in academia, writing, doing speaking engagements like this. And so I ended up following in their footsteps and applying to a PhD program. I received my PhD in American Studies, and then now I've been working at the AT&T Center for Indigenous Politics and Policy for the last 3 years. And there, again, I do the work of interacting directly with Native students. And I'm happy to talk more about those specific programs a little later on, but also with non-Native students, right? All students at the university, members of the public at events like this, and also through my research and writing. So I'm very passionate about this area, and I look forward to our discussion today, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much. Our next speaker I'd like to introduce is Carson Cabiro, a youth leader and community organizer from the Enjoy Indigenous community of Kenya. Carson is the co-chair of the Global Indigenous Youth Caucus. And Carson, I turn it over to you to share more about you, your commitment, documenting oral history and knowledge, and your work with the Youth Caucus.
Well, thank you so much, Anna, and thank you, UN USA, and for organizing all this. A special gratitude to all of you. I just wanted to speak in my language to greet all of you and say a blessing to all of you. Anege guranon kiburo kibet, abanu big chiba endorise in Lake Bogoria, Kenya. So agasala aberurot amita aga quick round. Let me just say what I said, go back a little bit. I introduced myself saying who I am and how proud I am to be with all of you today and to bless you from the land of my people, the Endorais in Lake Bogoria. So to go back to your question, Anna, it's a sincere gratitude once again to USA for organizing this special series. I'm currently at Lake Bogoria. This is the ancestral or the cradle land of the Endorais, my people. We call themselves as well in my dialect, Torais. And it's the heartland of my people. And it's so ancestral. Many of you, our listeners today, or even the panelists here, like Dr. Rule, I'm sure you've heard about the groundbreaking, the landmark case that the Endorais people won from the African Court of Human and People's Rights, at the 10th African Commission of Human and People's Rights in Banjul, the Gambia. Actually today, and this is a story that is worth sharing. Today, I was with one of my colleagues, an attorney, an advocate of the human rights. We went to the lake and we saw the devastation that has gone on from some natural disasters. Our lake currently, its waters have been rising for the last 9 years, and our people I've had to move for several grounds too, and this has been caused by other issues rather than natural disasters. I will explain later if someone asks a question. Let me not divert from what I was saying. So back to my inspiration, why I am in this space, especially why even I am here today. Special gratitude to the UN because I've been here because I first started to appear in the international stage in the Indigenous peoples diplomacy and movement 3 years ago through a grant by United Nations Voluntary Fund for Indigenous Peoples to attend the United Nations Permanent Forum for Indigenous Peoples. And that is where my leadership at the global level started because I started organizing at the Permanent Forum in 2018 in New York. I started organizing the African Indigenous youth who are already at the Permanent Forum to be attending the the meetings of the Global Indigenous Youth Caucus every day, which happens at the Secretariat building during the United Nations Permanent Forum for Indigenous issues at the UN. And at that level, we usually organize meetings every day since day one. That is on Sunday, we have a youth blast for the Indigenous youth to organize themselves for the first day on Monday all the way to Friday at the Permanent Forum. And at the end of the Permanent Forum in 2018, April, on it was on 22nd, the Global Indigenous Youth Caucus members unanimously elected me to be the co-chair, and a first one from Africa participation. And it's been a great run for the last 3 years, because, well, this is going to the third year, because we could not meet, and based on our election cycle, we have to do it at a permanent forum, and sadly we can't meet. And so it's been a great run for me to be able to serve, because this is purely a volunteer space to help the Indigenous youth to advance the issues that they face in their communities collectively in the 7 socioeconomic and cultural reasons. And so I've been able to participate as well in other UN spaces, like because, for example, United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs is the branch of Indigenous Peoples Unit is under DESA, that is. So we've been able to link with the United Nations Major Group for Children and Youth, that is UNMGCY. We also linked GIYC to United Nations Interagency Network for Youth Development. And currently I'm super proud with my colleagues, the co-chairs, Victor Lopez Carmen from the Yaqui people. Victor has been able to help us a lot in his leadership role as a co-chair, because he's been able to help us link with WHO. He's a medical student at Harvard Medical School. And my sister Jessica as well, who is the co-chair from she's a Mexican woman from Mexico. She's been amazing in this great run since last year when we were for me, I was re-elected and she was elected. And so at a Global Indigenous Youth Caucus, we were able to do what the first founders of Global Indigenous Youth Caucus saw as a vision. Because when we launched a book that we wrote together with the United Nations Office of the Secretary General's Envoy on Youth, together with Columbia University, we launched last year. It was a great milestone, and we could see tears from former members of GIYC, who right now some of them are almost in their 40s, and they were happy to see this happening. It was a great achievement for them. And GIYC right now is growing as well. Right now, we work with United Nations for FAO, Food and Agricultural Organization, United Nations International Fund for Agricultural Development. And as I mentioned, we are always trying to see that our space is available to make sure that we work on a diplomatic level to see that the rights of Indigenous peoples are promoted and protected, or are protected and promoted. And it's a training on the job for also Indigenous youth who would like to enter into service for their people. And so I don't want to go so much deep into that, but it is a blessing to be with all of you to shine a light on any other question that you may want to ask me today, because our time is not really long. Thank you so much, Anna, and thank you to my fellow panelists. I appreciate it so much.
Thanks for that great overview. I think you really highlighted how the Youth Caucus is working across so many different UN departments. And we can be honest, the UN is a big, complex organization. So the fact that you're there to help youth navigate it, and that's what we're trying to do with UNA USA too, hold that door open for others to be able to come in and peek inside and learn more about the UN. So thanks for that overview. To round out our panelists today, we have Nikki Fraser, an Indigenous advocate from British Columbia, Canada. And Nikki served in the Youth Envoys program for the SDG Young Leaders. And just so you all know, that the young leaders for the Sustainable Development Goals are 17 global citizens who've been recognized for the outstanding leadership and efforts to achieve the goals. And the 17 were selected from more than 18,000 nominations and work with the Youth Envoys Office on efforts to engage young people. Nikki, thanks so much for being here today to share your story.
So, thank you for having me. I'm so grateful that UNA USA has created this platform and space for this very important topic, and thank you to my fellow panelists. So I'll introduce myself in my language. Waikokwaita, Nikki Fraser, and Squest to Kamloops, Stechlin. So I said, hello everybody, my name is Nikki Fraser. I'm from Kamloops to Secwepemc, which is a part of the Secwepemc Nation in the interior of British Columbia, Canada. And so BC is located on the west coast of Canada. And I just wanted to acknowledge all the other Indigenous people online today that have joined us, and all the allies that are here that are wanting to create space and uplift Indigenous voices. So a little bit about me is, yes, I was a part of the UN Young Leaders Program for the Sustainable Development Goals. And that was a huge honor. I was the first Indigenous and the first Canadian to be a part of this program. And the first class was actually a nomination aspect. So there was over 18,000 nominations. And I think it's such an incredible movement. It's a young person's led movement for the SDGs, and to be the only Indigenous voice, I definitely felt a responsibility to advocate for more voices to be included. And my role is advocating for Indigenous women and girls, the rights for Indigenous women and girls, ending violence against Indigenous women and girls. And that all started back in 2013, 14, when my cousin Samantha went missing here in Canada. And in Canada, Indigenous women and girls were 5 times more likely to be murdered or go missing here in Canada. And being a mom, I'm a mom of 2, I have a daughter, I just felt like I had to do something. I wanted to be a part of change and make good change and be proactive. And so I started looking in my area in Canada and in my city on how I could do that. Where can I go? Where can I volunteer? And I found BC Native Women's Association, which is a branch from the Native Women's Association of Canada, which is a national level. And they have a volunteer board. And they have board members that vary from president to vice president, and there is a youth representative position. And having no experience speaking, no experience whatsoever, I just wanted to participate in any way that I can. And so I went from putting my name forward and shaking and crying during my election nomination speech to being elected on the board, to it progressing to 2 years later, me speaking at the Prime Minister's office, asking him, what is he going to do to protect Indigenous women and girls? And from that interview, I ended up at the UN. And so I share my story because I'm just a young person from the reserve that never would have thought in my wildest dreams that I would ever end up at the UN and being able to share my story and speak, but also go back every year and to be able to participate at an international level and engage at an international level as a young person's voice. I'm 30, almost turning 30, so I'm definitely now wanting more young people to engage and more young people to get involved. So that's now where my passion has shifted towards, is inclusion of Indigenous voices, especially young Indigenous voices. So that is me, and I just want to say thank you to everybody who used their language, Kukschachim. I think it's so important that we hear that in any dialogue, especially when it involves Indigenous people. Last year, the UN named 2019 the Year of Indigenous Languages. And last year at the Permanent Forum, Chief Littlechild asked that it be a decade long for revitalization of Indigenous languages. And I think it's so important that we practice it and we learn it. And even if we feel like we sound funny and just keep continuing on. I'm a proud language learner. I've been learning my language since I was 7 years old, since I moved back home. And I'm in my 3rd year of my undergrad degree. Don't plan on stopping until I have my PhD. I'm definitely going towards the law aspect here in Canada. So I was really happy to hear Elizabeth share her story with us. That I feel I can't wait to be able to say that about myself. It's so inspiring. So I do believe in education too. I'm the first in my family to be able to attend post-secondary school, and it's such an honor. So I'm so excited to participate in this conversation, and thanks.
Thanks. Now that we've all gotten to know you a little bit better, we're going to dive right into the issues. And I have a few questions to start off, but of course, for everyone in our audience, please keep using the Q&A box because we are going to have time to get to those. But just to kick things off, at UNA USA, we're constantly looking at the intersection of the Sustainable Development Goals and human rights. So I'd love to know, given your perspectives from your work with Indigenous communities, what are the Sustainable Development Goals that you find most integral to realizing the rights of Indigenous peoples? And we'll go in the same order. Dr. Rule, would you kick us off?
Sure, thank you for that question. And I have to say, we received some of these introductory questions in advance, and I had time to reflect on this question, right? Which is, again, what are some of the most important or the most important of these Sustainable Development Goals? And as I thought about it and looked at them, which range from, life underwater, life on land, clean energy, sustainable communities, gender equality, education, health and well-being, and so on. What I really came to in my reflection is that I don't think that we can prioritize one particularly over the other. And I think particularly in our position as Indigenous peoples, we bring that knowledge of understanding the interconnectedness of these areas to, what really truly is a sustainable, healthy lifestyle. Especially given the history and ongoing realities of colonization, we live in societies where things have become out of balance. And I think that Indigenous peoples are really in this critical position to bring our traditional ancestral knowledge and understandings of the interconnectedness of these areas of the world together. So I'm very happy to see that we have a space like in the goals where such a variety of topics are brought together. Working in a university, for example, I see that there are silos between the humanities and the arts, between the social studies, between the STEM fields. And that really shouldn't be the case, right? We know that, one's health influences one's, ability to, advance toward economic development or achieve their educational outcomes. We know that gender inequality affects these areas as well, right? When we have women who are oppressed, as Nikki was saying, that damages all of society. So again, I think that it's hard to say what is the most important. I think that we all have to recognize where we can best make our own input and our own impact. And that looks different for everyone based on the circumstance. But I think what's really critical about the goals is that it brings all of these areas together. And I'm really happy to see the knowledge again and the worldview that Indigenous peoples can bring to the table that unites what has traditionally been separated.
Thanks. Carson, what SDGs stand out to you?
Wow, Dr. Rule just mentioned about it's almost what she wanted to say is about SDGs are cross-cutting in nature. We cannot just talk about one and leave the other. I would say the issue about rights to Indigenous people. So we talk about climate change, SDG 16, for example, equality, education, just exactly what our sister Dr. Rule said. And if we want to talk about equality, there is justice, the land. leaving no one behind. So if we don't leave, we talk about sustainable development goals and not leaving anyone behind. What about the issues that indigenous peoples have been saying? Actually, we wouldn't want to say, to call the indigenous peoples issues. We are peoples. That is the key word. We have people. It's not issues. And so indigenous peoples have taken care of Mother Earth, like in a sustainable life way, in our own life ways, and devoid of overconsumption and overproduction. That is the key word to me. And all these issues are cross-cutting in the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Right now in COVID-19 and certain times, indigenous people's life ways come to the fore. Right now, we're asking ourselves of our knowledge base. As I talk right now, I'm in my people's land, and we usually take herbs. And let me just give you one issue that happened. 2 weeks ago, it's about 10 days ago, rather less than 10 days ago, I can't remember the exact date, in our nearest town, it's called Marigat, 5 people were tested positive for COVID-19 for the first time. We had been the only county in the country that had not been infected with COVID for in as much as COVID-19 came into Kenya. And so we're among the only 3 counties out of 47. And what happened should shock you. Ministry officials from, officials from public health in Kenya wanted to have a meeting in one of public facility, one of the hotels here. And what they did was to test the officials, the staff of our hotel around here. And when they tested, they got 5 people with COVID. That is random. They were not sick. They were not sick. And how people have been moving around, and among the issues that the government do, and I think, I'm not speaking on behalf of the government, is they usually test anybody that is taken to the morgue for COVID-19 so that they would be sure that it wasn't COVID-19, and how people have been dying around for some other issues. But when they tested, they got 5 people, and then they tested some contacts, they got another more. And so people were scared, but then they thought, and this is why I was talking about traditional knowledge and what we usually do, our indigenous life ways, the herbs, the treatment that we usually do for our people. In these COVID-19 times, we're going back, we're looking into our food systems, we're looking into our life ways that kept our people for thousands of years. And so they appear in sustainable development goals as cross-cutting. We cannot just pinpoint one. Thank you, Anna.
Definitely. And Nikki, want to make sure you get to weigh in here.
Thanks. I definitely want to echo what they both said. You definitely can't just focus on one. That's something, as the first class of young leaders for the SDGs said when we first were announced. They're like, well, what goal do you represent? And it wasn't that we represented, because there's 17 of us, it wasn't that we represented only one goal. And I like that Dr. Rural brought up the silos aspect, as if we did that, then we are definitely going to leave people behind if we worked in those silos aspect. And so when I look at the goals, you definitely can't work on one without working on another. And gender-based equality is focused on ending poverty, access to quality education for young girls, access to clean water, access to proper health care for women. So you definitely, they're interconnected. And I think that's something that Indigenous people know very well, especially when it comes to our cultural practices and traditions. And when I talk about language, that is, when I said that earlier in our introduction, our language is interconnected with the land. And so when I think about the goals that have to do with the land, I think about our language. And so definitely want to not just say this one's the first one we have to achieve. You definitely, for true sustainability, you definitely need to incorporate all and work all together for that. And that's truly leaving nobody behind. And so I liked hearing what the other panelists have said. It's definitely something I agree with, and something I also like the aspect of finding somewhere where you feel like you can contribute the best to. And so When people ask, I definitely lean towards goal 5 and 10. It's based on equality and inclusion. And that's where I feel like my voice and where I can contribute my best at and pushing the goals forward. But I have no problem and no hesitation on contributing on any other aspect of the goals. So thank you, Anna.
Thanks. I know another aspect that we really want to touch on during this session is the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which was adopted by the General Assembly in 2007. It took a few years for the US to finally get on board, but it did endorse the declaration in 2010. And it is important that we continue to educate about this declaration to government officials, making sure tribal leaders understand, that NGOs like UNA have a better understanding of the declaration, and how we can advocate for the measures that it puts forward at the national and international levels to protect those principles. Mm-hmm. And I would love, if we could just go in reverse order, Nikki, if you could start some ways that the public can continue to put pressure. At the UN, you've seen how the Youth Envoy's office works. You've been at the different forums. What are ways that we can continue to talk about the declaration as the general public to realize the rights that it outlines?
Thank you for the question. Yes, UNDRIP it's like in a very important landmark for Indigenous people. It happened in 2007, pardon me. And the first time I ever heard the term UNDRIP used was at an international forum when I was 25, and it was an international forum for Indigenous women of the Americas. And so all the Indigenous women from North, Central, and South America met in Guatemala, and I kept hearing this term, UNDRIP, UNDRIP, and I was like, what are we talking about? And this is my first international, so I definitely, being a young person, I feel like we need to also still educate our people about what UNDRIP is, so that we know how to advocate and push it forward. Also, not just Indigenous people, also educate non-Indigenous people on what this document is and what this instrument is. It's basic Indigenous human rights in this document, and that it's acknowledging that these groups of people had been here from time immemorial, and that they had their own way of living, their own way of governing, and to acknowledge that their knowledge that they have is valuable, and that their voice is valuable. Instead of being so suppressed, it's letting the lid off of that and giving the chance for Indigenous people to self-determination. So definitely, I feel like where we need to start is still that educational aspect. I'm very privileged to be able to go and travel and learn and engage at an international level to understand UNDRIP a little bit more, especially here at a national level in my own state in Canada. But that's not the case for the majority of the world. They don't know what the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People is. Neither do Indigenous people in some cases. So I feel like we definitely need to keep gearing towards educating and sharing what this document is, and pushing it forward that way. Because once more people know about it, I feel the more people we have to push. But being a young person, I was 25 and I didn't know that was the reality. And immediately I got and used my phone and Googled it and found out what we were talking about and why people were using it in their documents to push forward their issues, to bring their issues to the forefront. They were using UNDRIP as an instrument to protect their Indigenous human rights. And when we look at UNDRIP and I look at the SDGs, I feel like they're a mirror image of each other. And definitely there's overlap in that as well too. So if we know what the SDGs are and we are promoting the Sustainable Development Goals, I also feel like you also are promoting UNDRIP in a way. Here in Canada, we have endorsed it, but also here in BC, in my province, we have implemented it in 2019. We were the first province in Canada to do that. And it was this huge, remarkable thing. But then it kind of went backwards, because during that same time, we had Indigenous people in northern BC fighting against the pipeline. And we implemented UNDRIP, but then we take it back because we're not allowing Indigenous people for self-determination and free and informed consent. And so it's definitely tricky to maneuver through, but I feel like we just have to start and educate people about what it is, and so that they know how to properly use this instrument for the better, and also educate themselves. I learned so much when I first was wondering what this document is. What is UNDRIP? And now I know, and it's a powerful instrument, and it's something that can be so helpful for the Indigenous communities all over the world.
Yeah, thank you. And Carson, just curious how the Youth Caucus talks about UNDRIP in your work.
Well, just like Nikki said, it's a very weird observation. The Indigenous Youth Caucus is not, as far as I can remember, got deep into UNDRIP as a caucus. But we've been discussing in other spaces as well that we've come from in the collective of Indigenous peoples. And the declaration, as it is known as well, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, is not a popular document with most governments world over, simply because it speaks volumes about sovereignty, the rights. It's much more about the rights. Even the US government are not so much into UNDRIP. My country, Kenya, is yet to sign, but they've signed some other treaties that are almost same as UNDRIP, like, for example, Kyoto Protocol. And if you look at the way the country signed that treaty, is because just like any other developing nation, they usually sign into these treaties because there are some other, I don't know, English is not my first language. There's some other linings that they see they can get from signing this. For example, if World Bank comes in and says, hey, before we give you this kind of a grant, or before we join ourselves into doing this development project, let's cross-check. Have you done this? Have you done this? So they end up signing. Look, for example, the Central African Republic. They have signed. I mean, they've used, I don't know how to use in law, but they have signed UNDRIP. They recognize the declaration, but no one knows the main reason. They've also I think they've also assented to ILO. They're usually two more powerful documents for Indigenous peoples: the UNDRIP and the ILO 169. So all these things, talking on the perspective of Indigenous Youth Caucus, I have separated and just said about myself in the spaces. I'm so grateful to have been taught by wonderful, amazing teachers of this movement, and they've been there for over 40 years through Tribal Link Foundation, the Tribal Link Foundation, which is based in New York. For the first time before I participated in the UN, when I was 1 week before participating at the United Nations Permanent Forum for Indigenous Peoples, I went through another program that is called Project Access Training, and I have learned UNDRIP 101 on the UN System 101. So before getting into the UN, it was the most important thing that we needed to know, because just like Nikki said, UNDRIP is like, it's like the constitution of Indigenous people. It says everything that we would like to do. I would give you an example of how violation of UNDRIP has happened for me, for my people, and this is very personal. In our land, we had a precious, important, let me just use the actual term, extramoval. It is a special type of algae that was extracted from Lake Bogoria, and it was used to produce these denim jeans, these faded jeans that you see people wearing. So it just came in as a study from a certain university that I wouldn't mention here. And after that, we just overheard how it was extracted from our ancestral land, and it was used commercially without our knowledge. And if this had happened, you would see free, prior, and informed consent. And so we keep on talking about all these issues. and just taking back sustainable development goals. So before you engage with people, don't leave them behind. So thank you.
And Dr. Rule, even if you're not necessarily using the UNDRIP language, would love to hear more about how the center, talks about policy that is connected to it.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think what UNDRIP really demonstrates, particularly in my world, which focuses primarily on politics and policy, and specifically within the US context, what a document like UNDRIP demonstrates is that there are various mechanisms and frameworks for Indigenous advocacy that exist on a variety of levels, internationally, as well as nationally, on the state level here in the US, and then locally as well. One of the main areas that I see that needs improvement around knowledge of UNDRIP, as Nikki said, is just the educational component, right? Speaking here again about the context of the US, at least from my own experience and from what I understand, the majority of school children's experiences and the educational experiences of young adults, most go through their full educational system without even a fundamental understanding that again, in the US, tribes exist as political powers, right? As sovereign indigenous nations. And I know that that's not the case everywhere with all Indigenous communities, particularly on the global level. Different nation states have different levels and types of interaction with their Indigenous communities. But here in the US, you learn that there's the local government level, the state government level, and the federal government level. And I think it's really a travesty, and it's really a disservice, not only to Indigenous peoples, but to all people living here, that we don't have a fundamental understanding that Indigenous peoples have a particular special political status, right, as sovereign nations, and that there's the tribal level of government, right? Because again, going back to the idea of interconnectedness and the goals, it's, I think, inappropriate that someone would have to get to their career, right, in business, where they need to partner with a tribe, right? Or where a tribe is a major employer, or if they go into the politics field, right? And at any level of government, you're going to have to deal with your tribal neighbors, right? At any level of government. And so again, going back to this idea of education, we need to have a fundamental understanding, at least in the US, that tribes are sovereign indigenous nations with political governmental status, right? And then from there, understand how these various mechanisms, federal law, tribal law, state law, international efforts like UNDRIP, all come together to advocate for Native peoples.
Yeah, you actually bring up and start to touch on a question that one of our audience members has asked. Holly asked about teaching young people in schools about Native history and culture. This is something that I know our UNA USA chapters would like to do more of, to educate themselves about the land they might be on, or partners that they might have in their area. What are some of those resources that the general public can seek out? Maybe whether it's books or certain organizations they should be reading more from, documentaries. Would love just to have either of you talk more about that.
Absolutely. And the fact that you're interested in learning more is already a great place to start. I would say that it's critical that you learn from Native people themselves while not extracting more labor and knowledge power from Native people. So we have very strong news systems. There's a whole field on Native studies that is led and contributed to by Native scholars. We have these resources, and I would say, particularly to non-Native folks who are looking to learn more about Native communities, they should seek out this wealth of knowledge that currently exists. Native Twitter, right? Events that are happening there. That's a really easy, low impact way to just stay up to date with current events. I can say from my own experience too, as an educator and as a professor, we bring Native students to DC every year to take classes about government and policy on the federal level, and to teach students how they can take some of these lessons back to their own communities and become liaisons in whatever field it is. Again, going back to that idea of interconnectedness, but liaisons between their community and other areas. And one of the things that I actually experienced as the professor of these students was that sometimes these students who were coming to DC felt out of place in the nation's capital, right? It was maybe their first time leaving home. They came from a variety of urban backgrounds as well as reservation backgrounds. But there was this sense, right, that DC is not a Native place. It's not a welcoming place for Native people. And so I created an app to actually address that specific fact. The app is called the Guide to Indigenous DC. And the goal there is to chart sites and map sites of Indigenous importance. And it's really critical, again, to underline that these are both historical and contemporary sites. So everything from, you know, statues, national monuments, art installations, sites of activism show how DC not only is the historical and traditional homelands of a Native group, right, the Piscataway peoples, but also how we have this long history of Native peoples advocating on behalf of their communities by coming here to the US seat of power, right, to represent their tribes, again, on that government to government, nation to nation level. So I just throw that out there, right? If anyone is interested in learning about DC in particular, right, or how Native peoples fit into all of the tourism and history and, you know, visitation that goes on in the Capitol, I would encourage people to also look up the Guide to Indigenous DC, free and available in the iOS or Apple App Store. But I think, again, it's a variety of contexts, and I want to emphasize again that it's not simply historical information that people need to learn. It's also about the contemporary realities and actions and existence of Native people today.
Thank you. I'm going to download that right after this. Nikki?
Great.
I'm definitely going to download it too. I think that, thank you for sharing that. I definitely want to acknowledge, I believe her name was Holly who asked that question. That's the first step on educating yourself and taking initiative. And once you are educated, when you know better, you do better. And that's what Maya Angelou, a quote from Maya Angelou, she said, when you know better, you do better. And there's a wealth of information out there. There's a wealth of information out there. I am a huge reader. I collect books, especially by Indigenous authors. I also am a research assistant, so I definitely believe in Indigenous scholars. Find those research, those theses, those papers, and also want to talk about the contemporary aspect of Indigenous wealth and knowledge. There's artists, there's singers, there's writers, there's art performers, that Indigenous people are involved in any aspect of the world. And so if your element is in dance, there's an Indigenous person there that you could find, I know, and I found them too, that can be able to teach you in a way that your learning style is. And so it's just not reading and Googling things, it's definitely participating and partaking in Indigenous events, Indigenous activities, and engaging. I like the aspect that's the easiest way, and online, hashtag. There's so many ways to engage and learn, but I'm definitely a huge advocate for reading and supporting Indigenous scholars. Thank you.
Valgani had a really interesting question about the role of business in the private sector. I think we've been talking a lot about policy and work at the UN, but have you seen any examples of how businesses have been stepping up, not just with statements of support, but real work in supporting communities, engaging in contracts? I know that was mentioned earlier. Any thoughts on that?
That's a great question. I have that actually written down. I have the private sector written down in my note. And I feel like far too often we wait for government to initiate and implement certain documents. And that was going to be my message to the private sector, that don't just wait for government to say, okay, we're finally going to implement UNDRIP. Why don't you start making those implementations on your own? We have the TRC calls to action, which is the Truth and Reconciliation here in Canada. There's 94 calls to action about reconciliation. And so everyone here in Canada has a role to play on making those actions come to life, and have a responsibility of owning those 94 calls to action as well too, to be partake, Indigenous or non-Indigenous. The same thing with the 46 articles in UNDRIP. The private sector can look at UNDRIP and take initiative instead of waiting for government. And that's something one of my fellow UN young leaders who is in India, he said, far too often we're waiting for someone else to do it. And he started an initiative called Feeding India. Instead of just waiting for someone else to do it, he just started doing it. And so himself and the private sector started taking leftover food and dispersing it. And now he's fed over 1 million plates all over India. And that's achieving one of the goals. And that's just one small aspect. So I definitely believe that the private sector can take that initiative, but also know that when they do take that initiative to push UNDRIP, that it's Indigenous led, Indigenous created, and Indigenous inspired. Like, it has to have an inclusion of Indigenous voices and a diversity of Indigenous voices. I definitely want to go reflect back on the other question about learning about Indigenous people and how they could do that. Another small aspect is, if you are in a state or in a country or in a province or in a city, look up whose land that was before. That's the history, and go from there. Learn those traditions. And that's the same thing I want to give to the private sector. Acknowledge the traditional lands you are on, and who occupied and took care of those lands prior to colonization, and just go from there. I definitely feel like we don't have to wait for government to push that through. We all, definitely in the private sector, nothing's holding you back, especially just, yeah, that's the best way I could do it. But make sure that it's Indigenous led and Indigenous created for sure. So, yeah.
Thank you.
I absolutely agree. Thank you so much for bringing up those important points, Nikki. And just building on that, because I think you're absolutely right with all of those elements. Building on that, I agree that the private sector is an area where we can see real innovation, right? On behalf of, things like UNDRIP or advocacy for Native peoples. Another area where I think the private sector can get involved is simply breaking down this stereotype that Native peoples exist as, separate, right, from mainstream society, right, or disengaged. As the private sector, I would encourage you to get involved with Native businesses, right? There's a wonderful wealth of, business owners and tribes who have business initiatives, right? To partner with them on, consultations and initiatives that you may want to implement at the local level. And I think that also goes back to the question about educating yourself too. Another very good way to have direct positive impact with minimal effort, really anyone can do it, is to support Native artists, business owners, producers. You can buy Native roasted coffee, jewelry, clothes, foods, anything really. So, seek out those opportunities to really make your dollars and your contributions go toward a good cause, by engaging Native people.
Thank you. And we only have about a minute left, so I'm going to give the last question to Carson to answer briefly. This comes from Ferenc, who talks about, how we can all support this international movement, because we have a lot of US-based folks who are calling in today and maybe think about, Native American issues, and now we're realizing, we have Canada, we have Kenya, we have so many different voices represented just here today. This is such a multicultural movement. So Carson, when you work with the Youth Caucus and you work with young people from all across the world at the UN, what does that look like when we're talking about Indigenous issues, but on the global level? And how do, how is it, what's the best way for the general public to support that on an international scale and not just locally where they live?
Well, thank you, Anna, and sorry to my fellow panelists and our listeners today. I had issues with my connection. Sorry, I'm back. Good. So the best way to support, most of the time, almost what Dr. Rule said is most of our issues or most of our businesses, most of our initiatives are community-led. They're community-based, and wherever you are, how we have arranged ourselves, how we've organized ourselves, let me use that term, how we've organized ourselves as Indigenous youth. We have the 7 socioeconomic regions of the ECOSOC, that is, because that's most of the avenue that we use. Wherever you go to the Americas, that is the North America, when you go to the other region, that is South America and the Caribbean, when you go to Asia, Pacific, and in Africa, Arctic, just promote our indigenous products. Let me go to a very specific issue that I see in my country, and you might be probably knowing. We have the Maasai in Kenya, and the Maasais have been seen to be backward. And this is something that even most communities in Kenya would tell you that, most of our communities in Kenya would tell you, don't be backward, for example, like a Maasai. I know this is very derogative even to say that, and that is not the way to support an Indigenous person. Just let us be for who we are. That is the most important thing. Go back to the businesses. How, for example, the Maasais have been marginalized, for example, is how they were able to, for some international corporations to have been able to register their dress code and use it to appropriate it internationally without, and of course I've already used the word appropriation, without giving credit to who these people are. So it's already been said by my fellow panelists. And to the youth, they involved in tech innovations in our own Indigenous way, life ways. Please promote us, and in our own initiative to support our communities and to be who we are, to be proud for who we are. Just support. That is the most important thing. When you support, it comes just automatically, because you wouldn't be able to come with a prejudice before you engage with an Indigenous youth. You just come so easily and see me as a human. And I'm so happy to hear what my fellow panelists are saying. Was it Dr. Rule? She said that we are not exclusively a different society. We are human, and we are part of this great hearth, and we all take care of the hearth. We take care of each other. Just support us for who we are with our indigeneity. And there's a question that came before. If you allow me, Anna, to go back. I know we almost finished. It was about, I think I'm losing the train of my thoughts. Let it just be. Probably I will share via email. Thank you.
Yes, and unfortunately we are out of time today, but we are going to be able to continue this conversation. I'm happy to be a conduit to help with any further questions that arise. And hopefully everyone who's tuned in today is feeling inspired to take action, because there is something we can do right here and right now to be better allies. And we have the power to convey the importance of the rights of Indigenous peoples to our elected officials. So we've been discussing the UN Declaration and how it addresses, the intersections of Indigenous rights and fundamental freedoms. And again, recognizing that that document was the first time in history that Indigenous rights were recognized on the world stage. We need to call attention that the US is a supporter of this declaration, and that we need to fulfill the rights that are recognized in the convention. So advocacy for these policies is desperately needed in our communities, and you can let your member of Congress know that we need to uphold our commitment. So by texting Indigenous to 738-674, this is going to send everyone a link, and I hope everyone takes out their phone to do this with us right now. We're all inspired to take action. The letter that's going to go to your members of Congress calls out the deep-rooted challenges that continue to impact Indigenous peoples today, including healthcare disparities, lack of access to clean water, exploitation of land, and more of the other issues that we discussed in this webinar. So just text Indigenous to 738-674 and fill out that form to urge your members of Congress to uphold our commitments to Indigenous rights. Thank you. I'll send this out in an email to everyone after as well, but there's more ways you can take action with UNA USA by joining as a member. When you join UNA, you're joining 20,000 other Americans around the country like me who know the importance of the UN. We need to continue to support all different types of human rights issues. And I know our chapters are continuing to educate themselves more and especially stand up for Indigenous rights. And we've all learned so much today. And I just want to thank again our panelists for that. Finally, I also really want to encourage you all to attend our next GEO session. We talked a lot about the importance of youth voices today, and it'll really be on display next week when we celebrate International Youth Day with our new youth observer to the UN, Dustin Liu. He'll be discussing what he hopes to accomplish in his upcoming term, and we need as many people as possible to join that discussion so we can hear your thoughts and opinions that Dustin can bring to, and he meets with high-level UN officials. So that's all of my closing remarks. I want to thank again our incredible panel, Dr. Rule, Nikki, Carson, thank you for being with us, and thank you everyone for joining today.
Chokmashki, Anna.
Thank you, Kukshachin, for having me. I'm so grateful to be able to share this platform with you guys. I learned so much.
Thanks to all of you. Thank you for listening to us.
Yes.
Thank you.